Welcome to the Native Americans and Philanthropy podcast, where we have honest, straightforward, and to-the-point conversations about promoting effective and sustainable philanthropy in tribal communities. In this episode, Toni Sanchez goes behind the report to get an in-depth look at the Native Americans in Philanthropy research study that focused on the Indigenous community response to COVID-19 from one of the report's writers, Joseph Little. This episode is the newest installment of our COVID-19 Community Conversation series, and we hope you enjoy Behind the Report. Hi, welcome. I'm Toni Sanchez. I'm Seminole from the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and I currently serve as the Engagement and Communications Coordinator of Native Americans in Philanthropy. Thank you guys so much for being here with us today. So in December of last year, my organization, Native Americans in Philanthropy, published a comprehensive report, Indigenous Community Leadership in Response to COVID-19, a call to action for the philanthropic sector. The report identified $32 million that were funneled into Indigenous-led and organized initiatives between March and October of 2020. One of the key authors of that report is my colleague, Joe Little. Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, it's also good to be with you this morning, Toni. I'm Joe Little. I serve as the Indigenous Philanthropy Fellow here at Native Americans in Philanthropy, leading our research and data efforts. And I'm calling today from Portland, and I am Oglala Lakota and Gabrieleno Tongva.
Awesome. So, Joe, the reason that you're sitting here with me today is because we wanted to do a sort of behind the report, a behind the scenes look into the report that we published last December. I have to admit to our audience that I wasn't there from day one of the creation of this report, right? My role in this entire process, I came in much later, for the actual publishing and marketing of the report. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who's been there from day one, how did the report begin? Because I hear this story about how our executive director, Eric Stegman, wanted the answer to two particular questions. So can you confirm that? Like, how did this report begin?
That's exactly how the report began. Eric came to us with two questions of better understanding where this money was coming from, and two, where this money was going to, whether it was regional or tribal affiliated. Eric wanted us as an organization to align our efforts with research and data to reflect the work that the community was currently doing. We were seeing the rise of GoFundMe's on like Facebook and Instagram being shared across people's personal social media accounts, and how these like community sourced funds were able to generate so much philanthropic dollars just from using their social media platform. And I think that, in alignment with challenges at the time of accessing federal and state financial resources, was something that Eric wanted to elevate in our own work as an intermediary funder, and more specifically a Native-led intermediary funder in the space of philanthropy. And I think an additional layer onto that conversation that Eric brought was to expand on that conversation of where was this money coming from. So that would be the money that was being sourced from institutions, foundations, and organizations in the traditional way of conducting philanthropy, and then the non-traditional way of conducting philanthropy through the GoFundMe's. The GoFundMe's were able to generate millions of dollars just by sharing it across social media platforms. And I think that conversation with Eric, and especially seeing it on our own personal social medias, I think that is what sparked our interest to align our research and data efforts and create this report.
So, Joe, I wasn't there for the entire process of the development of this report. Like I said, that was you. You're the guy that sat with it from the very beginning, every single day. So I want to get your take, your firsthand account of how did the report evolve over time?
The first step in the report was definitely being in conversation with those that we have already that are in our network. So we created a COVID-19 resource center prior to me joining NAP. I think it was back in late March, early April, of when the resource center was in development on our website. And when I joined the team in July and early August, that's when Eric brought this conversation of how can we do more of a collaborative effort in this research study, and where collecting this data was a process of being in communication through email, through Zoom, or through phone calls with the Native-led orgs and Native-led foundations that generated these philanthropic funds. And so that was the first step. And then the second step was identifying a process of how are we going to collect all this information on the GoFundMes? GoFundMes were being shared in one example on Facebook. So we can't access all the GoFundMes on that social media platform, given the privacy of it being shared just on people's friends networks and the limitations on that search engine. So I think that is where we wanted to do it by regional practice. And so that's where we use a search engine like Google to search it by tribal affiliation, by region affiliation, and also by intention of the efforts. So some of the efforts were for food and water shortages, some were for access to healthcare, and even for paying for trucks to drive to provide healthcare services to community members that were in rural spaces. And I think from there, we began to collect all this data on regional affiliation, tribal affiliation for these philanthropic efforts while maintaining, because this was a work in progress as well. So funds were being donated to over time. It was by week, by month. And so this was something we had to continuously be in contact with our partners in this effort. And I think that leads me to like my next thought of the report. And I think that one factor we really wanted to highlight was the influence of media attention. There was one GoFundMe in particular that I don't recall what news network it was, but it was a national news network. And they interviewed the founder of the GoFundMe. And that interviewee happened to be somebody that we included in our community perspectives section of the report as well. So I think that was a factor that we wanted to be intentional about including in the report, because the report is supposed to be meaningful. It's not, here are these numbers and this is how philanthropy is conducted in Native communities. We definitely wanted to be more intentional about highlighting the qualitative aspect to this work beyond a quantitative research and data study.
I'm so glad that you brought up that the report is not just a collection of data, but it also highlights various community perspectives. It spurred an entire, what we've been calling COVID-19 community conversations. We held a webinar earlier this year. We've just filmed and published a conversation with our CISU, that's what I call her. It's our Chief Strategy and Operations Officer, Kelly Begay. She has a really wonderful conversation with Valerie Segrest of the Native American Agricultural Fund. They have a discussion about food systems, especially as it was affected during the pandemic. That's directly because of the fact that the report, so much of it is dedicated to getting those community perspectives, those interviews with those Indigenous community leaders and organizers that were there and were pivoting their resources in order to make sure that folks in tribal communities were getting the supplies and the resources that they needed. You've kind of touched on it a little bit about how it was such an essential part of the report, but why was that such a necessary addition?
I think that question goes along the conversation of how research and data studies are designed when working with Indigenous communities. And I think the term indigenizing is very important here, not to overuse it, but to also make sure that it grounds what our work is based off of values. And so I think the value that we wanted to uphold was the voice of the community. We ourselves, as Native Americans in philanthropy, were not the sole funder providing access to capital, access to financial resources for community needs. We saw ourselves as an organization that wanted to uplift these efforts through this research report. And I think being in conversation with those who were leading these funds was integral to add on to the data aspect as well, because we can look at a research report that presents these findings these quantitative findings and then draw a conclusion from these of the need to invest more in Native communities. But I think what is most important is hearing the experience and hearing the challenges and hearing how our community members, how they were doing this work. And I think that was why we wanted to be more intentional about coming all back together at the end of the report of what does this all mean? Yes, it is important for Native communities and Native organizers to create these funds. But what it means most is how can we create something that's sustainable? And that is bringing everybody to the table, not just somebody who's in the professional spaces, such as us in our organization, but it's even down to community members of where I believe one of the GoFundMe's is now its own nonprofit, and they're currently currently in the process of creating it as their own nonprofit. So I think that is just the best example of why we wanted to encapsulate this report and ground it by community voices.
So, Joe, we're actually sitting here creating, experiencing the latest, step that we've taken with this report, right? We've created this sort of series where we get to sit down with other folks and actually get a much more intimate and personal conversation. So now that we have reached a point where the report is completed, it's published, it's out there, the data is out there, I just want to hear from you. Like, what do you think are the next steps?
I think with the perspective of looking at the report and also partner organizations' work, because we're not the only organization doing work in this space. I think it is important to also speak on behalf other organizations. They are currently doing this work at the local community level as well. So I think when I have taken some time to read their work and also look at our work, I think it is important to reflect that what does all this mean? And I think there's two facets of it that that's been on my mind. And one specifically on research and data is how are we designing our research studies? I think that traditionally research studies have been more aggregated in comparison to, I would say, like an individually focused level. And I think that if we move towards I would say, a micro scale on research and data studies of being more in conversation with those who are a part of it and not just putting a foundation or a community as a data point in research, I think that is important. I think it's important to shift how we are conducting research and how we are providing this as a resource. Because at the end of the day, our work is supposed to be meaningful to support the community themselves, not to just uplift our own work. That brings me to like my next thought of how can we be more supportive as an intermediary funder to, one, better connect funders with nonprofits, for instance, for unique funding practices, because there's a lot of information out there and there's a lot of programs and projects that are out there that may not have the funding that they need, or may not know how to access the funding that they need. And I think that if there is a way that intermediary funders like Native Americans in Philanthropy and those in our partner networks can streamline that process of connecting all stakeholders, and that is a very timely process. It's not going to happen immediately. It comes with layers, especially with how many communities there are in rural and urban spaces. I think that would be a next step for our organization and also hopefully for other orgs in our network too, to support their communities in a different way. And in this case, what I'm speaking about during this time with you, Toni, is in research and data practices.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you so much for being here and speaking about this incredible report that I cannot stress this enough. You were such a key component in composing, developing, and getting this report out there. So thank you so much for all that you do. I just want to go ahead and also plug that you guys can find more information about not just the report, but the entire organization, Native Americans in Philanthropy. Just head on over to nativephilanthropy.org. That's our website. We also host the COVID report as well as a bunch of supplemental resources, like we have an at a glance guide. We have several recordings of our various COVID-19 community conversations. You can find that at nativephilanthropy.org/COVID-report. You can also, if you have any questions whatsoever that maybe weren't answered during our time here, feel free to reach out to us. Just email us at info@nativephilanthropy.org. And as always, please follow us on all of our social. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and at YouTube. Excuse me. What's happening? Just go ahead and search for @NativeGiving. That's usually where you can find us. So again, thank you so much, Joe. Is there anything else that you want to add or say anything to the folks at home?
I think I just want to say thank you, Toni, for hosting this today. I definitely had a great time chatting with you, as we always do. I just wanted to also say thank you to I don't think I ever had the opportunity to just speak out loud and say thank you to everybody that was committed to this work, especially because I was only just a research and data analyst and trying to produce this work to uplift the work of others in our community. And I think all I can think of today is to be appreciative of everybody that's committed to supporting their communities, as we all are working towards today.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We'll catch you later. Say bye, Joe.
Bye.